In this video, we will examine common scenarios in business intelligence using finance data. We will look at a few use cases which occur in business intelligence, such as changing the format of data. We will use Power BI and Azure Synapse Analytics to showcase the data quickly and scale effortlessly to meet the business need. This video is accessible to business users who are comfortable with Excel. Power BI is a great step for Excel users, and we will look at some of the most common scenarios that an Excel user might come across during some analytical work. So let's get started. Now, for many business intelligence projects, one of the first steps we always have to do is data cleansing. So we will use the Power Query tool embedded in Excel in order to access the data. Here's our sample data here. Straight away you see a problem. Some of the countries are mentioned more than once in the country name column. This would cause a problem since we would not be able to aggregate properly. You can see we have different group names as well. Now that's fine, it tells us that one country is repeated across different groups, such as Bahrain for example. So let's go to the Power Query tool. To do that, we go to Data, and then we go to From Table Range. This takes us to the Power Query editor, which you can see here. You can see and the steps we've taken on the data appear in the right-hand side in the Query Settings pane. We see we have the group name here. We simply want to use one group. It will be called World, but we don't see it here. So let's refresh and load more, and then we see the World option down the very bottom. So we will select that and then click OK. That will filter the data for us. So now we only have each country appearing once in the country name column. The country codes column is the ISO code. We also have a group code as well. Now what we can do is add in an index column. This can be useful for matching. So we select the opportunity to create the index column, and we will start it from row number 1. Normally we have the index at the very left hand side, so we can move the column over. Now our column appears in the right place. You can see the steps being added at the right hand side. We can scroll up and down and we can see the number of rows accessible in our data. We can do close and apply, and this takes us back to Excel. You can see we've created a new table called Table 1. You can see the query appear on the right hand side. It's highlighted in green. We can also see that Bahrain, for example, now only appears one time. So we can see the index column here that we added. There's an additional row, one for every index here. So we have 218 rows in total. If we want to go back in and change the query, we can right click on it, and that will allow us to edit it. Now let's look at how we upload our files to Azure Blob storage. Now we are in the portal, and we are in our Azure Blob storage account. We are in a container. Our container is called FS Balance Chalmers. and we are going to upload our file into it. This is our country data file that we saw previously. We can also set up another file as well. The IMF data file contains all of our finance data, so we can upload that directly to the Azure storage account too. Now our data is uploaded, and you can see the files appear in the middle of the screen. We can also rename them. For example, we can rename this one to country data. You can see our file has been renamed. Now we have Microsoft Azure. So let's have a look at Azure Synapse Analytics. And here's our Synapse workspace here. We already have a SQL pool set up. Now we can open Synapse Studio. This will allow us to interact with the data directly. It also will allow us to import our data from Azure Blob storage into Azure Synapse. It will be stored in a SQL pool. Now you can see some buttons here: Ingest, Explore, Visualize and Learn. We're going to ingest some data. We will use the Excel file. So all we need to do is select the Ingest button, and you can see the left-hand side details of the source and destination, and then it will deploy the changes for us. We can access the file from the Blob storage here. We select it, and it gets uploaded. Azure Synapse will need to know the schema for the data. So we can enter the sheet's name here, and we can also identify the first row contains the header information. When we do this, we will get a preview of the data. This tells us that Azure Synapse Analytics is able to read the Excel file properly. This sometimes takes a moment when the file has been read for the first time. You can see how easy it is to ingest the source data. It's already been uploaded, and here's our data here. Now we need to specify exactly where the data is going to go. To do that, we're going to create a connection to Azure Synapse Analytics. You can see it in the right-hand side here. Now, all of the information is available to us because it's contained in the same subscription. So all we have to do is select the options from the drop-down box, give it the username and the password, and then we are ready to use Azure Synapse Analytics to store our data. This forms a connection that lets us know where the data is supposed to go to. So now we can use Azure Synapse Analytics to store our data in a table. So we can give the table a schema name and also its own name. We will use the IMF data schema. If the schema is not there, it will be created for us. Now we can use the table, we'll call it Azure Data, and that's where our finance data is going to be stored. Now you can see all of the columns are listed here, along with the type of data. Then we can click Next, and then we have some settings. We want to do a bulk insert of the data, and then all we have to do then is click on the Next button. It also tells you the cost. And here we have a summary details, the source and the destination. The great thing is we've done all of this without any coding and difficult. The beauty of the cloud is that we pay for what we use. So now a deployment has been set up, and our data has gone from Azure Blob storage into the Azure Synapse Analytics SQL pool. So let's have a look at our data. On the left-hand side, you can see the database in the SQL pool. You can see the tables here. Now, you may need to do a refresh a couple of times so that you can see the new table and you can see the new data. Now we can see our table, and we right-click on it and we can create a new SQL script in order to see the data. Now, this may take a few turns in order to try and view the data. When we click Run, you can see the query's been run, and then we can run it again, and we should see some data soon. You can see it's a select statement, like we normally use dealing with SQL Server. Now we see our data has been correctly loaded. You can see the columns, and this appears as we see in the Excel file if we were to open it. Now we can go back and we can ingest our country data as well. So let's take a look. To do that, we go to the Home tab, and then we can use the Ingest button again. This will set up a brand new pipeline for us. We will have a new source and a new destination for the data. We will use Blob storage as before, but instead we will use a different file this time. We will use the Excel file that contains our country data, and you can see it here. So we can now select the next button to start to ingest our data. Now this time it doesn't quite identify it's an Excel file properly, so we need to choose Excel file from the drop-down list. We can enter it in the sheet name as well. You can see that in the middle of the top pane. We click the Edit button and then type in the name of the sheet. And our example is table number 1. We also identify the first row as the header, and you'll recognize this data from the previous example. Then we can click on Next, and we can send that data to Azure Synapse Analytics. As before, we can specify a new table name for that. We'll use the IMF data schema, and we can call it country data. You can see that here. Here's our column mappings, which you can see here. As before, we want to do a bulk insert, and then we can click on the Next button. This provides a summary of the transfer of data, and you can see here the data going from the Azure Data Lake storage over to Azure Synapse Analytics, where it will be stored in the SQL pool. Now we've finished transferring our data, so let's take a look at it in Azure Synapse Analytics again. This time you can see we have two tables. Here's our new table here, so bottom half of the screen. The select statement is the select statement that you'd expect to see in Microsoft SQL Server, for example. It's very easy to read. You can see we can create new tables in Synapse using SQL-like language. We have created a new table using a select statement. This time we've created a heap table using a round-robin distribution. It's a small amount of data, so round-robin is good for that. It will replicate the data across the different nodes. Now we've created a new table. You'll see this table's got a new column in it called row ID. We set that up in the last SQL statement. So we have a new table called IMF data. It's got the same name as the schema. So now you can see our data. To summarise, we've set up 2 tables and we've created a third based on another table. These are examples of the sort of things you might do when you are working with data. We need to create a new schema. We tend to do this in business intelligence when we want to identify dimensions. So we will call this one dim. So the statement is very easy to read, and we will use the dim dimension in order to create a new table. Our new table will hold the dim country data. Basically, it's going to store the country data that we ingested, and we rename one of the columns so it reads ISO. So now when we select the data, you can see we haven't taken all the columns from the original table. We've just taken the key, the ISO code, and the country name. Now we can create some views. These views will help us to clean the data before it gets to Power BI. So you can see we don't have any views, but let's create one. We'll create a view that's only going to look at US dollars in the units. You'll have seen from the data that we can have it in units, billions or percentage. So we are simply looking at units here. When we create our view, then access the data, you can see the units are simply US dollars. When we look down, you can see the view filters it correctly. It's acting like a lens on the original table and only giving us units that are in the scale unit format where the currency is set to US dollars. So we can also create other views as well. We could set one up that's simply going to look at GDP percentage. So we select from the table where the units are equal to percent of GDP, which you can see in the last line of the statement here. Now let's access that view and make sure that we can see it. We also want to be able to be sure that we can see data. So let's run another statement that will show us the top 100 rows. So the data will be accessed and viewable in the bottom half of the pane, and you can see it here. This time the units are sent to percent of GDP. Now, in business intelligence, it's important to be really clear with the data. We don't want to mix up units, percents and billions. It may sound funny, but this is something I often see when I see reports. People are mixing up the ways that the data is represented. Here's another example where the scale is set to billions and we're only looking at US dollars. So then we can create this view, refresh the views folder from the left hand side, and then we can access the data simply by running a SQL select statement. If you are familiar with using SQL Server, you will be very familiar with SQL statements, and you can use them in Azure Synapse Analytics. So now you can see the results of the SQL query appear in the bottom half of the screen. You can see the data, and this tells us that our view is working. So to summarise, we've set up tables and views, and now we can access those in Power BI. The first step is to make sure that Power BI can access the data in Azure Synapse Analytics. To do that, we set up a connector using the Ingest Data facility. You will need the SQL pool link in order to access Power BI. And when you do this, you are able to access the SQL pool. Here we will select the data from the 3 views and also the country table as well. The previewed, and you can also successfully see the data has been loaded. At this point, Power BI is ingesting the data. The data will appear in fields separated by the tables and views, and it will appear in the Fields pane at the right-hand side. You can see the data has been loaded. At this point, Azure Synapse Analytics is doing all the hard work and simply presenting the data as easily as possible for Power BI to ingest. Now you can see our data. It's not any different whether we access the data as views or tables. In Power BI, it looks like the same thing. So we can select the country name in the dim country table. Simply by doing that, we can see we get a map immediately. Now we can also add in additional columns. Here we've added in the country name and the ISO code. We can turn this into a filter. Currently it's in a table format. So we can select the filter visualization in the right-hand side, and we can remove one of the columns. Then we can put the filter into a slightly better position. So we can see we have a filter set up. We can also copy and paste it. We can drag it over to the right-hand side. Then we can change that by adding in new columns and fields. If we add in the year, then we can see it appear in the table. We will use a table format. Now we can add in the value. Now country name is blank for the moment, but that tells us something is wrong with the data somewhere. When we scroll down, we should be able to see some country names appearing. So let's take a look. Now when we scroll down, we can see some country names. We can also separate out the columns so they are easier to read. So here we can see some country names are blank, so let's get rid of them. We can go to the country name filter here, and we can deselect the opportunity here to remove the blank fields. We select them all but remove blank. Now we see the blank rows have gone. We can also change it in the filter as well, since we also see blank appearing in the filter. We can change the filters at the right-hand side. Here we're adding in a new filter for the year. So we have got two, one for country and one for year. And we also have a table as well. Although this is a very simple visualization, it tells us we can access the data. We can also change the filters so we have more control over them. Here, we're switching off the opportunity to multi-select and adding in a select all feature. This will be easier for the users to use. We can also add in additional information. Here, we are going to filter this page. You can see our country names all appear in a list. If we want, we could remove specific countries. In this example, we will select them all, and you can see them appear in a big list. We could also add in other columns to filter on as well. We still have a blank appearing in country name, so we can change that so that the blank is removed again. And that looks better. This is very flexible since it means you can change the options dependent on the visual. And then we check to make sure our filters work. You can see here we have filtered by country and also by year. We've simply created a table, but this is a good start in order to be sure that we can see all the data. Let's add in a title. We do that by adding in a text box. We can change the font, and you can see the title here. We can then reshape it and resize it so it can go exactly where we'd like it to go. You could also add in an image if you like, such as a company logo. To do that, you go to the Insert tab and choose Image, which you see at the right hand side. Now that looks better. We can also sort by columns if we like. We're also going to remove the totals from the bottom. We can do that by clicking on the table and selecting Totals to be off. You can see now that the totals disappear. We can also rename the page which we see at the bottom of the screen. We can also duplicate the page, and this duplicates everything for us. This gives us a great start, since it means we don't have to redo the filters or the title. We can change those. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make this more visual. It's always good to do a check of the data first, and we've done that with our table. So we can choose one of the visualizations from the Visualization pane at the right hand side. We can also sort the data in different columns. You can see the filters have also been preserved. Now we're going to make a line chart. So all we're going to do first of all is select the table. We can copy and paste and change the title as well. And we can do that simply by selecting it and changing the text. You can see that the format remains the same. So you can see we still have a table, and we can click on it and we can change the visualization itself. In this example, we're going to select top 10. This will only show us the top 10 values. We're going to choose the value, and that will be the metric by which we select the top 10. We apply the filter, but nothing changes because we have still selected everything in the filters. It makes more sense to think about choosing the top 10 by each year. So what we can do first of all is rename the value so it goes to GDP, and that makes it more clear. So what we can do then is we can look at country name and year, and we can select only one year at a time here. However, we can select more than one year, and that might be a bit confusing for the viewer. So we are going to change this filter so that it only is possible to select one at a time. So to do that, we select the filter, go to the Visualizations pane and select the single select option. Now we see we have radio buttons, and it makes more sense now. We see the top percentage GDP for all of the items where it's only the top 10 are included. We can also sort by GDP, and we can sort by the years, and we can also make the columns resized as well. So we can make the country so it's a bit wider, for example. And then we can sort by GDP in ascending or descending order. We can make it smaller, and we can then start to add in a different visualization. So let's do that. Let's click on it, select the copy option, and then paste. Now you can see we can have made a pasted copy, and we can move that to the bottom part of the screen. We can turn this into a map. So to do that, we don't need the year, and then we can select the map visualization. And you can see a map of the world appear at the bottom. And it's automatically given us the top 10 by GDP. So we can see the values for Africa, for Equatorial Guinea here, match what we see exactly on the table. And we can quickly check by sorting it. So this gives us a great opportunity to create new dashboards very quickly without having done any coding at all. So now we can duplicate this as well, and this time we'll create a line chart based on the same data. We'll remove the filter though, which only shows the top 10. We're going to rename the page so it's nice and clear. Then what we can do is remove the parts of the dashboard we don't need. We're going to change the filter so this time we can multi-select and have more than 1 year if we like. So we can click on the table and we can then think about removing a part of the chart we don't need to make more space. So let's get rid of the map. Now we can change this to a line chart. So we can click on it and we can create a line chart by choosing the Visualizations pane. But first, let's get rid of that filter. This time we want to see all of the different types of GDP, regardless in the top 10 or not. So let's remove that filter. So let's choose the basic filtering option and we remove blank. If this was in real life, we try to understand why we have blanks in there. But for now, let's choose Align Visualization. So firstly, it looks quite odd, it has so much on the page. So let's put the axis at the bottom. You can see that country name is the axis, so it looks a little bit odd. We can also change the year, so it becomes the axis, and that will appear in the y-axis at the bottom. And that will start to make more sense. We can get country name that we see there, we can remove that, and then we can add in country for the legend. That will split the data out so that each line represents a different country. We can also rename the value here as well, and it will be GDP percentage. We can also change the title so it matches exactly. So let's rearrange the chart so it looks a bit bigger. We notice straight away that the years look a little odd. They're not in the right order. Instead of the years going from left to right in ascending order, they're in descending order. So we need to change that. So to do that, we click on the year column here, and then we can go to the modeling tab in column tools. We can text to a whole number. Now we see the year is correct. You can see straight away peaks and troughs in the data. So here we have Equatorial Guinea in 1992 with a very high negative percentage. We can also see Algeria and how that looks. Now we can examine the data a bit further. You can see here that it looks much better now. The years make more sense and the visualization is more clear. We can also double check our data. When we look at the subject descriptor, for example, we can see that it's aggregating lots of percentages. We only want to choose one. So let's choose gross national savings. That changes the visualization quite significantly. It makes it more clear now. We are dealing only with one metric. We could create other examples using the different metrics, for example. We can go through and make that change for every page, or we could do it for the whole report instead as well, if we like. We are using filters on all pages here to change the subject descriptor to only refer to that specific metric. We can also double check that by adding in new charts, for example. To summarise, we have created a Power BI dashboard. We've used Azure Synapse Analytics in order to do that. We've also set up the dashboard with no coding. We haven't required to do any. Azure Synapse Analytics is doing all the heavy lifting for us. So let's have a wrap up. Along the way, the video has explored a few common cases which occur in business intelligence, such as working with dates. It's obvious that Azure Synapse Analytics is really clever technology. It would allow us to do so much with our data. It's already a good option for people who have SQL expertise in business intelligence. So we have a manageable learning curve. Power BI can work with many different technologies. However, it's particularly suited to Azure Synapse Analytics, which can serve the data quickly and scale effortlessly to meet the need. It's also accessible to business users who may not be comfortable in coding, but who can use Power BI or Excel. Power BI is a good step for Excel users. And this video has shown some different scenarios where we might actually use Azure Synapse Analytics to produce different dashboards with the same data. We hope you have enjoyed this video. As an exercise, perhaps you could think about the ways that you could use units and billions data. Thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to your feedback and we hope to see you another time.